When people first encounter the teachings of the Buddha, there is often a moment of quiet discomfort. Among all the philosophies, religions, and spiritual systems that speak of love, joy, salvation, or eternal bliss, Buddhism opens its doors with a truth that seems, at first glance, almost harsh. There is suffering. For many, this seems unnecessarily grim. Is this a pessimistic religion? Is Buddhism, with its statues of serene figures and its emphasis on mindfulness, ultimately built on a gloomy foundation? This misunderstanding arises from a subtle misinterpretation, both linguistic and existential. The first noble truth that life contains dukkha is not a doctrine of despair. It is not a complaint. It is not even a belief. It is a diagnosis, a recognition, and most importantly, an invitation to awaken. The Buddha did not teach suffering as a problem to be avoided, denied, or suppressed, but as the very gateway to liberation. His was not a philosophy of sorrow, but a path of clarity and freedom. To see dukkha clearly is to begin walking toward a life free from delusion, clinging, and the endless cycles of reactivity that define much of our experience. But what is dukkha, really? Often translated as suffering. The Pali word encompasses a much broader and subtler range of meanings. It refers not just to pain or hardship, but to the persistent unsatisfactoriness that weaves itself into every corner of conditioned existence. Even when things are good, they never seem quite secure. Even moments of joy carry an undertone of fragility. There is a sense that something is always slightly off, that what we chase never lasts, and what we fear cannot be avoided forever. This is not because life is cruel, but because everything that arises is subject to change. The first noble truth does not declare that life is suffering. It declares that in the realm of the conditioned, nothing ultimately satisfies. In the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, the Buddha's first discourse after awakening, he did not preach a system of beliefs to be accepted. He did not ask for faith. Instead, he pointed directly at the truth that had been overlooked by the world. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what one wants is dukkha. There is nothing in this list that requires belief, only honesty. The first noble truth is not something we are told to believe. It is something we are invited to observe. To recognize dukkha is not to fall into nihilism or resignation. In fact, it is the opposite. It is to step out of denial. It is to look at life not with fear or bitterness, but with the courage to see it as it is, impermanent, vulnerable, ever-shifting. Dukkha is not presented to us as a wall, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, we see the mechanisms of our own craving and clinging, our resistance to impermanence, our struggle to control what cannot be controlled. In this way, dukkha is not the problem, our refusal to face it is. Modern life has given us countless ways to avoid dukkha. We are surrounded by distractions, addictions, comforts, and technologies that promise relief. But beneath the surface, many remain restless. The mind continues its search, moving from one object of desire to another, hoping that this time it will be different. We keep postponing peace, imagining it will come after the next success, the next relationship, the next achievement. Buddhism does not oppose pleasure, nor does it glorify pain, but it dismantles the illusion that any of these things, by themselves, can offer lasting fulfillment. It asks, can you sit still, right here, and see clearly? There is a profound spiritual dignity in the Buddha's teaching on dukkha. While others may offer temporary comfort or divine promises, the Buddha offers clarity. He treats us not as children needing stories, but as beings capable of truth. In this way, his compassion is radical, for he does not rescue us from our discomfort, but shows us how to walk straight into it and through it with awareness. The first noble truth is not the end of the road. It is the beginning of awakening. In facing dukkha, something remarkable begins to happen. We start to see the world not as a source of personal disappointment, but as a field of phenomena unfolding according to causes and conditions. We begin to soften the demand that things go our way. We start to recognize the futility of resisting change. And in this release, a quiet freedom begins to dawn. The grip of craving loosens. The compulsions lose their power. The heart becomes spacious. It is worth noting that the Buddha never said that existence is hopeless. Rather, he taught that by understanding dukkha, we can also understand its cause, its cessation, and the path that leads there. This is a crucial point. The Four Noble Truths are not four problems, but four insights. The first is to recognize dukkha. The second, to understand its roots in craving. The third, to realize its cessation is possible. And the fourth, to follow the path of practice that leads to freedom. Dukkha is not a punishment, but a pointer. It reveals to us where our attachments lie. And with mindfulness, we can begin to let go. So we return to the question, is Buddhism pessimistic? Only if truth is pessimistic. Only if honesty is bleak. Only if freedom from illusion is to be feared. But those who walk the path know otherwise. They know that the willingness to see dukkha clearly is the beginning of a life no longer dictated by it. They know that true peace is not found by running from suffering, but by seeing it as it is, and stepping beyond it. This is the essence of the first noble truth. It is not something to believe. It is something to investigate, to explore in our own body and mind, to test with our own breath and thoughts and reactions. It is not a dogma, it is an open doorway. And if we have the courage to walk through it, not with despair, but with curiosity and mindfulness, then we will find, as the Buddha did, that freedom is not somewhere far away. It begins here, now, in the simple act of seeing clearly. To truly understand the Buddha's teaching, we must begin not with doctrine, but with language, not with belief, but with experience. The word dukkha is often translated as suffering, and while that is partially correct, it is also deeply inadequate. Suffering, in English, tends to imply dramatic pain, physical torment, grief, or despair. But dukkha, in its original Pali form, is far more subtle, far more pervasive. It is not only the sharp pangs of obvious pain, but also the quiet dissatisfaction that lingers beneath even pleasant moments, a background hum of unease that follows us through the highs and lows of life. To grasp the first noble truth is not to merely admit that pain exists, but to see that all conditioned experience is marked by this lack of ultimate satisfaction. The Buddha's choice of the word dukkha was not poetic, but precise. Etymologically, it is thought to derive from demeaning bad or difficult and ka, referring to an axle hole, the center of a wheel. In ancient Indian carts, if the axle hole was misaligned or poorly fitted, the wheel would not turn smoothly. It would wobble, shake, resist the journey. Life, the Buddha observed, is like that wheel. It turns, but it grinds. Even when things appear to move forward, there is friction. Even when the path seems clear, there is a subtle instability. This metaphor contains the whole of human struggle. We try to steer our lives smoothly, but there is always something that does not quite cooperate. Change, aging, loss, disappointment. This is dukkha, not the drama of tragedy, but the basic mismatch between our desires and the nature of the world. In the early texts, the Buddha explains that there are three types of dukkha. The first is dukkha dukkha, the pain of pain, direct, immediate suffering such as illness, injury, or grief. This is what most people think of when they hear the word suffering. It is universal and inescapable. No matter how wealthy, powerful, or insulated one may be, pain visits every life. But this is only the surface. The second kind is viparima dukkha, the pain of change. This is the suffering that arises when something pleasant ends, the sorrow of losing what we love, the anxiety of knowing joy cannot last. It is the ache that follows beauty, the shadow cast by every gain. The third kind, and perhaps the most profound, is sakra dukkha, the suffering inherent in conditioned existence itself. It is the deep, existential restlessness that comes from living in a world that is constantly shifting, where everything arises due to causes and conditions and is therefore impermanent, fragile, and uncontrollable. This last form of dukkha is the most difficult to grasp. It is not about specific events, but about the very nature of being. It is the discomfort that arises simply from having a body that ages, a mind that fluctuates, an identity that is never stable. Even in moments of success or joy, this form of dukkha lingers, the knowledge that what we hold dear can be lost, that what we build can decay, that what we are is not fixed. It is the anxiety of impermanence, the stress of attachment, the quiet fear that lies beneath all clinging. We chase pleasure and run from pain, not realizing that both are impermanent and therefore unable to bring lasting peace. In this way, the Buddha reveals that dukkha is not just the presence of suffering, but the condition of suffering, a condition that arises whenever we expect the impermanent to be permanent, the unstable to be stable, the impersonal to be personal. Modern life, for all its advances, has not escaped dukkha, it has merely disguised it. We are busier, more connected, more entertained than ever before, yet inner contentment remains elusive. Technology has given us access to information and distraction, but not to wisdom. We suffer not just from what happens to us, but from the gap between how things are and how we think they should be. This is the silent dukkha of expectation, of subtle craving, of the restless heart. We are told we can be anything, have anything, do anything, and when we fail to find lasting peace in this pursuit, we are confused. Buddhism points not to the failure of our efforts, but to the flaw in the assumption itself. It is not that the world has betrayed us, but that we misunderstood its nature. Even pleasure, which we so often chase, carries within it the seed of dukkha. Why? Because it is fleeting. When we grasp at it, we suffer. When we fear its loss, we suffer. When it inevitably fades, we suffer again. The Buddha did not condemn pleasure, but he warned us against being enslaved by it. He taught that clinging to anything, even the most delightful experience, is to plant the conditions for suffering. Like drinking salt water to quench thirst, craving more leads only to more dukkha. And so he invites us not to reject the world, but to relate to it differently, with awareness instead of attachment, with clarity instead of clinging. We might wonder, if all conditioned experience is marked by dukkha, is there no joy, no beauty, no peace? The Buddha would answer that joy exists, but it is fragile if rooted in what changes. Real peace arises not from controlling the world, but from understanding it. Beauty shines brighter when we no longer try to possess it. Love becomes more tender when it is not based on control or expectation. Even pain can be met with compassion when we are no longer consumed by aversion. The teaching on dukkha does not remove the possibility of happiness, it refines it. It leads us from the pursuit of temporary highs to the cultivation of a deeper, more stable equanimity. Understanding dukkha is not a rejection of life, but an invitation to meet life on its own terms. It is to see clearly, and in that seeing, to stop fighting against the flow of change. It is the foundation of the path not because it is negative, but because it is honest. Only when we see the nature of the wheel, unstable, misaligned, can we learn how to walk with balance and wisdom. The Buddha's diagnosis is not meant to wound, but to wake. And in that awakening, the path to freedom begins. At first glance, the acknowledgement of dukkha may seem like a spiritual burden, an unwanted truth that darkens our view of life. Many traditions promise comfort through denial, distraction, or belief in future rewards. But the Buddha took a radically different approach. He did not shield his followers from discomfort. He did not promise them salvation by faith or magic. Instead, he pointed directly at the wound, and then, with infinite compassion and clarity, taught how to see it without fear. The recognition of dukkha, far from being a prison, is the first key to freedom. Why? Because truth is not what binds us, delusion is. And when we look directly at the truth of our condition, something profound begins to shift. To see dukkha clearly is to step outside the fog of reactivity. Most people are so embedded in their experience of life that they rarely question its deeper patterns. They react to pain by running, to pleasure by grasping, to uncertainty by clinging to control. This cycle, known in the Pali texts as ta, or craving, becomes the unseen engine of suffering. But when we pause, observe, and truly see the nature of dukkha, we interrupt that momentum. The mind, which is usually racing to fix, to gain, to avoid, begins to soften. In this space of honest observation, we begin to encounter a deeper intelligence, a kind of quiet knowing that does not come from books, but from seeing clearly how life unfolds. This is why the Buddha emphasized direct knowledge. He did not ask his disciples to accept his words blindly. Instead, he invited them to investigate their own experience. He often said, "Come and see for yourself, ehai pasiko." When we observe our minds closely, we begin to notice the habits that cause us distress, the craving for things to be other than they are, the tension of trying to hold on to what is slipping away, the anxiety of protecting what we fear to lose. These are not philosophical problems, they are lived realities, and they can only be resolved by direct insight, not belief, not suppression, not escape. In this way, recognizing dukkha becomes an act of empowerment. It is a shift from victimhood to wisdom. We no longer blame the world for our dissatisfaction. We no longer chase after someone or something to complete us. We no longer imagine that the next success, relationship, or possession will finally bring peace. Instead, we begin to see that the very structure of clinging is the source of suffering. And from this understanding, a gentle letting go begins. Not a forced renunciation, not a denial of life, but a natural, intuitive release, like exhaling after a long-held breath. Many people fear that by looking too closely at dukkha, they will become cold or detached. But in truth, the opposite happens. When we stop demanding that life be perfect, we become more intimate with it. We see others not as obstacles or means to our happiness, but as fellow beings sharing in this fragile, impermanent human condition. Compassion arises, not as a virtue we try to adopt, but as a natural expression of understanding. We stop judging ourselves for suffering and stop judging others for their confusion. We realize this is what it means to be human, and in that realization, our hearts open. It is also important to understand that recognizing dukkha is not the same as being overwhelmed by it. Awareness is not the same as depression. When the Buddha spoke of dukkha, he did so from a place of profound inner peace. He had seen dukkha completely, understood its causes, and was no longer caught by it. His insight did not lead to despair, but to freedom. In meditation, as we sit with our thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations, we learn to hold even our discomfort with a spacious awareness. We begin to see that suffering is not an enemy to be defeated, but a process to be understood. And in that understanding, its grip loosens. This is why mindfulness, sati in Pali, is so central to the path. Mindfulness is not merely being present. It is being present with clarity and non-reactivity. It is the ability to observe the arising of dukkha without becoming entangled in it. When pain arises, we notice it. When craving arises, we recognize it. When resistance arises, we meet it with curiosity instead of aversion. This is not passivity. It is deep courage. It takes strength to face discomfort without fleeing, to remain steady in the presence of impermanence. But as we develop this quality, something extraordinary begins to emerge, the freedom to choose our response. This freedom is not theoretical. It shows itself in the smallest details of life. We no longer need to lash out when insulted. We no longer need to grasp at pleasure or run from fear. We can meet the ups and downs of existence with equanimity, upekkha, not because we are indifferent, but because we are wise. We know that everything that arises passes. We know that joy does not need to be clung to, and pain does not need to be feared. We begin to dwell in a middle space, grounded, aware, open. The Buddha often described this freedom as nibbana, the cooling down of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion. But it begins here, in the simple yet radical act of facing dukkha without turning away. This is why the first noble truth is not negative. It is a light in the darkness. It reveals the terrain of human experience so that we no longer stumble blindly. It allows us to navigate life with eyes open, heart open, and mind awake. To deny dukkha is to remain in bondage. To see dukkha clearly is to walk the path toward liberation. In the end, what the Buddha offered was not a set of comforting ideas, but a way of seeing, a shift in perception so profound that it transforms how we relate to everything. When we no longer demand that life fulfill our fantasies, we begin to see its beauty more clearly. When we no longer cling to what is passing, we become more fully present. And when we no longer fear discomfort, we discover an inner stability that no circumstance can shake. This is the quiet miracle of the first noble truth. It is not a philosophy of despair, but a gateway to awakening. Despite the central importance of dukkha in the Buddha's teaching, it remains one of the most misunderstood concepts in the modern world. Much of this confusion arises from how dukkha has been translated, simplified, or stripped from its context. When people hear that Buddhism begins with life is suffering, they often recoil, imagining a worldview that is grim, hopeless, or life-denying. But this is not what the Buddha meant. And to reduce the first noble truth to a bleak aphorism is to miss the profound wisdom it actually offers. To truly understand dukkha, we must first clear away the misconceptions that obscure it. One of the most pervasive misunderstandings is the belief that the Buddha was pessimistic, that he looked at life and saw only darkness. This is not just inaccurate. It is the exact opposite of his realization. The Buddha did not teach dukkha to instill fear or despair, but to point to a path beyond it. He saw clearly that there is suffering in life, Yes, but more importantly, he discovered that there is a way out of that suffering. His teachings are not born of resignation, but of liberation. He was not a fatalist, but a realist, and a compassionate one. His message was, look carefully at the truth of your condition, and you will find the key to your freedom. Another misunderstanding is the idea that dukkha refers only to obvious pain. The things we already know are unpleasant: illness, war, loss, injustice. People hear that Buddhism talks about suffering and say, of course, we already know that life is hard moments. But what they don't see is that the Buddha was pointing to something far more subtle and universal. Dukkha is not only about major life events, it is about the very structure of ordinary experience. Even in the midst of pleasure, there is unease. Even in moments of joy, there is anxiety about the end of that joy. Even when nothing appears to be wrong, there is restlessness, the feeling that something is still missing. This is why the Buddha said, whatever is felt is included in dukkha. At first, this seems strange, even extreme. Does this mean that even happiness is a form of suffering? Not exactly. It means that as long as we cling to any experience, pleasant or painful, there will be dukkha. Pleasure is not the problem. Clinging is. When we try to hold on to what cannot last, we suffer. When we try to avoid what cannot be avoided, we suffer. And so the issue is not the content of experience, but our relationship to it. This is not a moral judgment, but a deep psychological insight. It is not about being good or bad, but about seeing clearly how the mind creates tension through craving and resistance. There is also the mistaken belief that by recognizing dukkha, we are supposed to reject life, to turn away from joy, beauty, or human connection. But the Buddha never taught a doctrine of renunciation based on denial or repression. He did not ask people to stop loving, feeling, or engaging with the world. Rather, he asked them to see the nature of what they are engaging with. To love without clinging is not detachment. It is a deeper, freer form of love. To enjoy beauty without needing to possess, it is not rejection, it is reverence. To feel the full range of human emotion without being overwhelmed is not coldness, it is maturity. The spiritual path is not about withdrawal, but about wisdom in relationship. In fact, the misunderstanding of dukkha often arises when people approach Buddhism with rigid dualism, as if one must either enjoy life or reject it, either feel emotions or suppress them. But the Buddha's path is the middle way, not indulgence, not denial, but mindful engagement. When we understand dukkha rightly, we do not become ascetics who fear the world. We become clear-eyed human beings who can meet the world as it is, without falling into delusion. We begin to see that everything, joy and sorrow, gain and loss, birth and death, arises and passes. We are no longer enslaved by the highs, nor crushed by the lows. This is not disengagement, it is liberation from reactivity. Another common distortion of dukkha is to frame it as a punishment, or to interpret it through the lens of guilt or sin. But Buddhism does not speak in the language of moral retribution. Dukkha is not something we deserve. It is simply the natural consequence of craving in an impermanent world. Just as fire burns because of heat, not because it is angry, suffering arises because of conditions, not because we are being judged. This insight removes the personal drama from our difficulties and allows us to relate to them with compassion instead of shame. We are not broken, we are simply caught in a pattern. And patterns, once seen, can be unlearned. In the modern mindfulness movement, another subtle misunderstanding has taken root. The idea that meditation will make suffering go away completely. People are taught to sit quietly, breathe, and calm down, and when discomfort still arises, they feel they have failed. But mindfulness was never meant to be a technique for suppression. It is a way of opening to experience as it is, not as we wish it to be. The goal is not to eliminate dukkha by force, but to understand its nature so deeply that we are no longer bound by it. In this sense, awareness is not an escape from pain, it is a doorway through it. Perhaps the deepest misunderstanding of all is the idea that recognizing dukkha makes life less meaningful. But in fact, the opposite is true. When we stop pretending that things are more stable, more perfect, or more controllable than they are, we begin to cherish them more. We see the preciousness of each moment, not because it lasts forever, but because it doesn't. We listen more closely. We love more honestly. We live more fully, not because we are trying to accumulate pleasure, but because we are no longer afraid to be present, far from robbing life of meaning. The teaching on dukkha restores it. It breaks through our numbness and wakes us up to the fragile beauty of existence. The Buddha's teaching on dukkha is like a mirror. It shows us what is already here, but we have avoided seeing. And once we look, really look, we can no longer live in the same way. We begin to walk differently, more gently, more consciously. We stop reaching for happiness outside ourselves and begin to discover it in the quality of our awareness, in the freedom of non-clinging, in the intimacy of presence. This is not a philosophy. It is a living path. To truly understand dukkha, we must go beyond abstract principles or philosophical reflections. The Buddha was not interested in intellectual speculation for its own sake. His teachings were always grounded in the reality of lived experience. Dukkha is not a remote idea tucked away in sacred texts. It is woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. If we look with honest awareness, we will see that it shows up not only in moments of obvious pain, but also in subtle and hidden ways, in the quiet discomfort beneath our smiles, in the tension behind our busyness, in the restlessness that follows even our happiest moments. We feel dukkha in the hurried pace of our days. From the moment we wake up, we are often propelled by a sense of lack, a feeling that something must be done, fixed, improved. The alarm rings, and the mind already races, tasks to finish, expectations to meet, problems to solve. Even in the absence of crisis, we are uneasy. This discontent is not always dramatic. It might be a vague tension in the chest, a tightness in the jaw, a sigh we don't quite understand. It is the ache of never feeling quite at ease, the craving for something more or something different than what is here. We encounter dukkha in relationships. We want love, but often attach it to conditions, approval, control, security. We fear being abandoned, misunderstood, or not enough. And so we grasp at others, try to shape them, or protect ourselves from vulnerability. Even in the presence of intimacy, there's often a silent anxiety. Will this last? Will I be hurt? Will I be left alone? This fear doesn't mean we lack love. It means we don't yet understand the nature of clinging. We want certainty in a world of flux. We want others to remain the same when everything is changing. In this gap between desire and reality, dukkha rises. We meet dukkha in our pursuit of success. We work, we strive, we chase goals. There's nothing wrong with achievement, but when our sense of self-worth becomes entangled in it, we suffer. No matter how much we accomplish, there's always more to do, more to prove. The joy of success quickly fades, and we're left wondering why it didn't satisfy us for long. This cycle is not due to failure. It is the nature of craving. Even when we win, we fear losing. Even when we have, we want more. And so our contentment is always just out of reach, like a horizon that moves as we walk toward it. Even pleasure, when clung to, becomes a source of dukkha. Think of the anticipation before a vacation, a meal, or a romantic encounter. There is excitement, hope, longing. Then comes the experience itself, perhaps delightful, perhaps not. And then it ends. The moment we wanted is past, and we are left with memories or longing for more. If it was good, we miss it. If it was disappointing, we regret it. This restlessness is not a flaw in us. It is the structure of grasping in an impermanent world. We cling, and clinging hurts, even to the beautiful things. Dukkha also manifests as comparison. We measure ourselves against others, often unconsciously. Who has more? Who is happier? Who is more admired? Social media magnifies this suffering, offering curated images of joy and perfection that hide the messy truth of life. We scroll through highlight reels and feel strangely empty. Why? Because we are comparing our insides to someone else's outsides. The Buddha saw this long before smartphones existed. He saw how the mind, driven by craving and delusion, constantly judges. Am I good enough? Am I winning or losing? And in this habit of measuring, we lose the ability to rest in what is. Dukkha hides in the way we relate to time. We regret the past. We worry about the future. We rarely feel at home in the now. Even in moments of peace, the mind is often elsewhere. A meal is eaten while thinking about work. A conversation is half heard because we are distracted. A walk in nature is missed because we are replaying an argument. This disconnection is itself a form of suffering, a subtle exile from our own lives. And mindfulness begins to heal this. As we learn to inhabit the present, we begin to see how much of our stress is not caused by the world, but by our untrained mind wandering through imagined landscapes of what if and if only. Another everyday form of dukkha is resistance to change. We know that life moves, yet we want it to stay still. We resist aging, endings, loss. We try to freeze the good moments and rush through the bad. But life refuses to obey our preferences. Hair grays, friendships drift, plans unravel, bodies weaken. The mind resists. And that resistance becomes a second layer of pain, not the change itself, but our fight against it. The Buddha called this viparima dukkha, the suffering that comes from the truth of impermanence. When we do not understand it, change feels like a threat. When we do, it becomes a gentle teacher. Even our identity can be a source of dukkha. We cling to who we think we are, our roles, our achievements, our stories. We say, I am this kind of person, and defend it fiercely. But identity, too, is impermanent. Roles shift. Circumstances change. The self we try to solidify keeps slipping through our fingers. When we mistake the constructed self for a solid essence, we live in fear of anything that challenges it. But when we see that the self is a process, fluid, conditioned, ever-changing, we begin to loosen our grip. This loosening is not nihilism. It is freedom. And so, dukkha is not merely pain in dramatic moments. It is the background hum of our unexamined life, a restlessness that follows us even into success and comfort. It is the subtle contraction of the heart, the constant search for something else, the inability to be fully at home in what is. But this is not bad news. In fact, it is the most compassionate diagnosis ever given, because once we see where suffering arises, we can begin to unweave it. We can bring mindfulness into every corner of our life, not just on the meditation cushion, but in traffic, in conversations, in work, and in rest. When we see dukkha manifesting in daily life, we stop dividing the spiritual from the ordinary. Washing dishes becomes practice. Listening becomes liberation. Saying, I don't know, becomes wisdom. The path does not lie in escaping life, but in meeting it with awareness and understanding. This is what the Buddha meant when he said, I teach only dukkha and the end of dukkha. He was not offering a belief. He was offering a mirror, a map, and a method. To walk the path that the Buddha laid out, one does not need to adopt a new belief system or worship a distant deity. One only needs to begin looking inward, directly, without judgment. This is the power and beauty of mindfulness, not as a modern stress reduction technique, but as a radical, ancient tool for liberation. Mindfulness, or sati in Pali, is the key that unlocks the hidden machinery of dukkha. It shines a clear and unwavering light into the moment-to-moment experience of life, making visible what we usually overlook. The constant pull of craving, the tightening of resistance, the flickering rise and fall of feelings. Without mindfulness, dukkha hides beneath the surface. With mindfulness, it is seen for what it truly is, and once seen clearly, it begins to unravel. The Buddha never asked us to blindly believe in suffering. He invited us to observe it. And observation in this sense is not cold or clinical. It is intimate, courageous, and sustained. Mindfulness is the practice of attending to our experience in real time, just as it is, without distraction and without escape. We sit, breathe, and watch the river of sensations, thoughts, and emotions flow through us. We notice how pleasure arises, and how we immediately try to prolong it. We notice how pain arises, and how we flinch, judge, or mentally run away. We begin to see, in direct experience, that it is not the sensation itself that causes suffering, but our relationship to it. A painful sensation in the body, for example, is simply a cluster of shifting impressions, heat, pressure, tingling, dullness. But if we resist it, if we tense against it, fear it, or identify with it, the mind contracts. That contraction is dukkha. A thought of anger or sadness may arise. But if we grasp it as mine, or react with guilt, the thought hardens into a story, then into a wound. That hardening is dukkha. Mindfulness allows us to catch these patterns in the act, to see craving, aversion, and delusion not as abstract enemies, but as real-time movements of the mind that create suffering in that very moment. When practiced deeply, mindfulness begins to uncover a radical truth, that no moment is inherently painful or pleasant. It is our clinging and resistance that shape the flavor of experience. A sensation is just a sensation. A thought is just a thought. But when we fuse with them or push them away, we create a knot of suffering. Mindfulness gently loosens that knot. It teaches us to abide in experience without being pushed and pulled. We learn to stay, to breathe, to soften, to observe the arising and passing of all things. And in doing so, we begin to discover something unexpected, a space of freedom within the storm. Mindfulness is not about becoming passive or indifferent. It is about cultivating a mind that is both alert and equanimous, able to feel fully without drowning. In this state, even difficult emotions like grief or fear can be held with kindness. They no longer dominate or define us. We begin to realize that the mind can be like the sky, vast enough to hold any weather. And in this vastness, dukkha begins to lose its grip. We are no longer reacting blindly. We are seeing clearly. And with clarity comes wisdom, panna, the deep understanding that liberates. As mindfulness matures, we begin to see not just the presence of dukkha, but its causes. We see the craving behind our actions, the aversion behind our judgments, the confusion behind our distractions. We notice how quickly the mind wants to fix, improve, or run from what is here. We notice how much energy goes into avoiding discomfort or chasing validation. And this insight is not depressing, it is empowering. Because when we see the root of suffering, we are no longer helpless. We can choose differently. We can let go, not out of force or denial, but out of clear seeing. In fact, mindfulness reveals that letting go is not a heroic act. It is simply the natural response when we see that holding on causes pain. It's like putting down a hot coal once we realize it is burning our hand. The problem is not that we lack strength, but that we haven't seen clearly. Once mindfulness exposes the patterns of suffering, wisdom steps in. The mind, tasting freedom, begins to incline toward release. This is the gentle turning of the heart toward nibbana, not as a mystical state far away, but as the cessation of grasping here and now. Mindfulness also teaches us to recognize the impermanence of all things, anicca. Every thought, feeling, and sensation is in motion. And when we deeply understand this, our clinging begins to weaken. Why grasp what cannot stay? Why resist what will soon pass? The realization of impermanence is not cold detachment. It is the doorway to peace. It helps us ride the waves of experience with balance. We no longer collapse when pain arises, nor cling when joy arrives. We move with life rather than against it. Another gift of mindfulness is the cultivation of compassion, not just for others, but for ourselves. As we become more aware of the ways we suffer, we begin to soften toward our own struggles. We see the habits that keep us stuck, not with shame, but with understanding. We realize that behind every act of clinging is a longing to be safe, whole, at peace. This insight melts harshness. It allows us to bring tenderness into the very places where dukkha lives. And this tenderness is transformative. It turns the practice into a path of healing. In the end, mindfulness is not merely a tool, it is a way of being, a way of relating to life that is honest, open, and wise. Through it, we learn to face dukkha without fear. We learn to greet each moment as a teacher. We begin to trust experience, even the difficult parts. And slowly, quietly, we taste freedom not as something added, but as something revealed. Freedom was always here. Mindfulness simply clears the dust. This is why the Buddha placed such emphasis on samasati, right mindfulness. It is not optional. It is essential. It is the path to knowing dukkha fully, and, through that knowing, walking beyond it. At the heart of the Buddha's teaching lies a profound truth. It is not enough to merely recognize that suffering exists. We must come to deeply understand why suffering arises, how it operates, and most importantly, how it can end. This understanding is not intellectual, not a theory or belief. It is a direct, experiential insight, born of a quiet mind and a sharp awareness, into the mechanics of dukkha and its release. The Pali word for this liberating knowledge is panna, usually translated as wisdom. But in the Buddha's framework, wisdom is not something passive. It is an active force, a clear seeing that cuts through confusion, dissolves clinging, and brings freedom. Wisdom in the Buddhist path is always paired with mindfulness. Mindfulness reveals what is happening. Wisdom understands what it means. Together, they expose the causes of suffering, ta, upadana, and avijja. These forces are not mysterious. They are visible in each moment, if we are attentive. Every time we grasp at pleasure or push away discomfort, every time we take the impermanent to be permanent or the not-self to be self, we are participating in the creation of dukkha. And the moment we see this clearly, not once, but over and over, the grip begins to loosen. This is the purpose of deep meditation. Not to escape the world, but to look into its nature with unwavering attention. As the mind settles through the practice of samatha, it becomes a sharp tool for vipassana. With a steady mind, we begin to notice how all things arise and pass away, not just once in a while, but constantly. We see that sensations come and go, thoughts appear and vanish, emotions rise and dissolve. There is nothing stable to hold on to. And when we stop trying to hold, we stop suffering. One of the most transformative insights that wisdom brings is the realization of anatta, the absence of a fixed, independent self. This does not mean that we do not exist in any form. It means that what we call I is not a solid, unchanging entity, but a process, a flowing, shifting interplay of body, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. When we mistake this impermanent process for a permanent self, we fear change and death. We cling to identity, defend our views, and protect what we believe to be me and mine. But when we see through this illusion, the burden of ego begins to lift. We stop taking things so personally. We begin to relate to life with spaciousness and humility. Wisdom also reveals the futility of craving. In ordinary perception, it seems that if we just get what we want, the right job, partner, recognition, or comfort, we will be fulfilled. But insight shows us that the pleasure we seek is always fleeting, always unstable. It is not the objects we crave that bring suffering, but the act of craving itself, the hunger that never ends. When wisdom sees this clearly, the mind stops chasing. It begins to settle into a deeper contentment, not because it got everything it wanted, but because it finally understands the truth. Lasting peace cannot be found in what changes. This insight is not dry or harsh. It does not make us indifferent to life. In fact, it makes us more alive, more open, more kind. When we no longer need things to go a certain way to feel okay, we become less reactive. We are no longer thrown into despair when plans fail or people disappoint us. We see these events not as personal attacks, but as part of the nature of existence, impermanent, uncertain, and impersonal. This doesn't mean we stop caring. It means we care more wisely. Without attachment or illusion, we love without clinging. We act without needing to control outcomes. We respond instead of reacting. This is the peace of a wise heart. The Buddha compared wisdom to a light in the darkness. Without it, we stumble, grasping at shadows. With it, we begin to see clearly, not just the world, but ourselves. We see how the very structure of our ordinary thinking is shaped by misunderstanding. We think, this is mine, this is me, this is who I am. But when wisdom shines through, we see that there is nothing we can truly own, nothing that stays the same, and no permanent self to protect. This seeing is not depressing. It is liberating. It allows us to let go, not with bitterness, but with joy. And this joy is not dependent on conditions. It is the joy of release, of not being caught. It is the quiet happiness of a mind that is no longer ruled by craving, no longer enslaved by identity, no longer afraid of change. This is why the Buddha described the end of suffering, nibbana, as the highest bliss, not because it is a place or a reward, but because it is the natural peace that arises when the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion are extinguished. Importantly, wisdom is not something only monks or scholars can attain. It is not the privilege of the elite. It is the birthright of anyone who looks deeply into their own heart and mind. Whether we live in a monastery or in the middle of a busy city, whether we sit on a cushion or walk through the chaos of daily life, we can practice seeing clearly. We can ask, is this clinging? Is this aversion? Is this real? Is this lasting? And with each honest look, the veil lifts a little more. In the Buddhist path, wisdom is both the fruit and the guide. It deepens with practice, and it guides the practice further. It is not static. It grows with each insight, each letting go, each compassionate act. And as it grows, it transforms not just how we feel, but how we live. We stop creating new suffering. We begin to embody the peace we once sought outside. This is not magic. It is the natural unfolding of a heart that sees. Thus, the role of wisdom is not to explain suffering, but to end it. Not to analyze life, but to awaken within it. This awakening is not somewhere else. It is here, in this breath, in this step, in this moment, if we are willing to see. It may seem paradoxical that a path to peace begins not with bliss, but with suffering. that the gateway to liberation is not through pleasant fantasies, but through the firm and unflinching recognition of dukkha. And yet this is exactly where the Buddha began. He did not begin his teaching with promises of salvation or eternal happiness. He began with a simple but revolutionary invitation. Look clearly. See the truth of suffering in your life. This was not a message of despair, but of honesty, and from that honesty, a profound kind of freedom becomes possible. The first noble truth is not a belief to accept. It is a fact to investigate. The Buddha's language is precise. Is Dukkha Arya Sakha. This is the noble truth of dukkha. He is pointing to something that can be seen, felt, touched, known directly in our lived experience. Not just pain, but the deeper unease that runs through even our most ordinary pleasures. That slight tension of trying to hold on. That background worry that something will go wrong. That quiet dissatisfaction that even in moments of joy, something still feels incomplete. This is dukkha, and the more deeply we recognize it, the more we start to turn inward, not to escape life, but to understand it. To acknowledge dukkha fully is to begin the work of awakening. But this requires courage. For most of us, suffering is something we try to avoid, distract from, or fix externally. We chase pleasure, success, approval, hoping these things will protect us from life's inherent instability. But they never do. The Buddha invites us to stop running, and instead to look directly, to feel the sting of loss, the weight of fear, the grasping and desire, not as failures, but as signposts. Each moment of discomfort is an opportunity to understand. Each experience of clinging is a doorway to letting go. This shift in attitude is itself a liberation. Suffering is no longer something to fear or hide from. It becomes our teacher. And with that, a kind of spiritual maturity begins to grow. We start to see that happiness is not found in avoiding pain, but in transforming our relationship to it. We begin to sit with discomfort instead of reacting. We begin to inquire into our emotions instead of suppressing or dramatizing them. We begin to listen to life as it is, not as we wish it to be. And in that listening, something deep and peaceful begins to emerge. This is why the first noble truth is not a pessimistic doctrine. It is the key that unlocks the rest of the path. It is like diagnosing a disease before finding a cure. Without seeing the illness, we cannot heal. Without acknowledging suffering, we cannot be free. But when we see it clearly, not with blame or self-pity, but with wise attention, then everything changes. We begin to taste the possibility of another way of living. The Buddha's genius was in presenting dukkha not as the end, but as the beginning. It is the foundation upon which the remaining truths are built. Once dukkha is known, we are naturally led to investigate its cause, craving. We begin to see how suffering is not random or inevitable, but conditioned by how we relate to our experience. We see the mechanics. A feeling arises, craving follows, clinging takes root, and suffering is born. And then, through mindfulness and wisdom, we begin to break that chain. We begin to weaken the causes, and thus, suffering begins to fade. In this way, the first noble truth is not just a statement, it is an invitation. It calls us to wake up. It asks us to stop numbing, stop escaping, and instead to investigate. It invites us into the heart of life, where both pain and freedom reside. And it assures us, what you are feeling is not your personal flaw. It is the universal condition of sentient life. You are not alone. Every being who has ever walked the path has begun with this same recognition. And every awakened one has passed through it to the other shore. That other shore, nibbana, does not lie beyond suffering like some distant reward. It lies through it. By entering fully into the truth of dukkha, by knowing it completely, we exhaust its power. We see its causes and undo them. We begin to rest in a peace that is no longer dependent on pleasure or control. A peace that is untouched by the winds of gain and loss, praise and blame, birth and death. This peace is not given from the outside. It is discovered here and now when the fires of craving burn out. And so, we return again to the Buddha's first and greatest gift, truth. Not comfortable lies, not spiritual entertainment, but truth, sharp, clear, compassionate. Truth that frees. This is why he said, "He who sees dukkha, sees the Dhamma." Because in seeing suffering rightly, we see the whole path unfold. We see its causes. We see its cessation. We see the way forward. This is the sacred role of the first noble truth. Not to discourage us, but to point the way. Not to bind us in sorrow, but to call us toward wisdom. In a world where so much energy goes into avoiding pain, the Buddha offers something rare. A path through it, to the unshakable stillness beyond. Understanding the first noble truth is not meant to be an abstract exercise. It is not enough to hear about dukkha in a lecture, or to repeat the word like a mantra. To truly awaken, the truth of suffering must become personal, immediate, and alive in our daily life. It must be recognized in the morning traffic, in the quiet loneliness of a sleepless night, in the small disappointments and the deep heartbreaks, in the frustration of wanting things to be different, and in the subtle clinging to things when they are just as we want them. This truth is not a distant doctrine. It is what we live every day. And when we begin to see it clearly, even the simplest moments become opportunities for liberation. The first step in living this truth is cultivating the willingness to pause. We are so used to rushing, to reacting, driven by habits, opinions, and unconscious desires, that we rarely stop to observe what is actually happening inside us. But every pause is sacred. When we pause, we create a space in which awareness can enter. In that space, we may notice that our irritation in the supermarket queue is not about the delay, but about the fear of wasting time. Or that our sadness after an argument is not just about the words spoken, but the deep longing to be seen and understood. Dukkha is not just pain. It is how we relate to pain, how we cling, resist, or identify with it. And this can only be seen when we slow down and look. Mindfulness becomes our most trustworthy companion in this journey. It allows us to meet each experience, joyful or painful, with an open heart and a curious mind. With mindfulness, we don't push dukkha away, and we don't wallow in it either. We simply observe. This is the tightness of craving. This is the sting of aversion. This is the confusion of delusion. In this simple act of recognition, something begins to shift. The suffering loses its power to overwhelm us. It becomes a mirror, showing us not what is wrong with the world, but how we are relating to it. This is the beginning of true inner freedom. Another essential reflection in daily life is to examine our reactions. We can ask ourselves, in each difficult moment, am I adding to this suffering? So often, the original discomfort, a harsh word, a mistake, a loss, is magnified by our mental commentary. We replay events in our minds, blame ourselves or others, predict more pain in the future. This layering is not inevitable. With practice, we can catch ourselves in the act. We can notice the moment where a thought turns into a story, where a feeling becomes a fixed identity. And in that noticing, we gain the power to stop, to breathe, to let go. Daily life is also filled with subtle forms of clinging. We cling not only to people or possessions, but to routines, roles, opinions, and even to our spiritual progress. We may begin to notice how we want people to behave a certain way, or how we resist any change to our plans. We may catch the pride in being a good meditator, or the disappointment when we don't feel calm after sitting. All of these are forms of attachment, and therefore potential causes of dukkha. Recognizing them doesn't require self-judgment. It requires gentle honesty. The more we become aware of our attachments, the more lightly we can hold them. Relationships, too, become a field for insight. Every time we feel hurt, jealous, ignored, or unloved, we can look deeper. What was I expecting? What was I holding on to? What did I want the other person to validate in me? These are difficult questions, but they lead to real growth. We begin to see that our suffering is not caused by others, but by our own unexamined demands and assumptions. And from this seeing, compassion is born, both for ourselves and for those around us. We realize that everyone is struggling. Everyone is reacting to their own version of dukkha. This softens our heart, and kindness begins to replace blame. Work, ambition, and productivity are also worth examining. In a world that measures worth by achievement and output, it is easy to lose ourselves in constant striving. But beneath the striving, there is often a subtle sense of lack, the belief that we are not enough as we are. This too is dukkha. The Buddha's path doesn't require us to abandon our responsibilities, but to approach them with greater awareness. Can we work with care, but without attachment to results? Can we act from compassion rather than insecurity? Can we find rest in the midst of activity? These are the questions that turn daily tasks into spiritual practice. Even pleasure is a place for reflection. We are often taught to chase pleasant experiences and avoid unpleasant ones. But when we observe mindfully, we see that even pleasure is tinged with unease. the fear of its passing, the craving for it to continue, the subtle anxiety of dependence. This doesn't mean we should reject joy. On the contrary, we are invited to enjoy life more deeply, not by clinging to moments, but by meeting them fully and letting them go. We taste the sweetness without grasping, and in that, a deeper joy is revealed, one that is not bound by conditions. Ultimately, living the first noble truth means living with truthfulness. It means daring to meet life as it is, not as we fantasize it to be. It means welcoming both joy and sorrow, gain and loss, with the same balanced awareness. This balance is called upekkha in Pali, equanimity, and it arises not from indifference, but from deep understanding. We begin to see that all things are impermanent, that nothing is truly ours, and that no fixed self lies at the center of experience. And in that seeing, we relax. We stop fighting reality. We rest in the flow of life, knowing that everything that arises will pass. In the end, the practical application of the first noble truth is not about adding something to our life, not another task or burden, but about subtracting. It is about removing the layers of resistance, craving, and confusion that keep us entangled in suffering. What remains, when we let go, is simplicity, presence, a clear mind, and a loving heart. We begin to live from a place that is not reactive, but responsive, not driven by fear, but guided by wisdom, not trapped in dukkha, but free in the middle of it. This is the quiet revolution the Buddha offered, not a dramatic escape from life, but a radical reseeing of it. One breath at a time, one moment of awareness at a time, one gentle, honest encounter with dukkha at a time, until, little by little, we discover that the way out is not elsewhere. It is here, in the very heart of what we once feared. And it begins with the simple, courageous act of seeing. In the end, what begins as a confrontation with suffering becomes the most intimate journey into peace. What starts as a gaze into dukkha becomes the opening into a new kind of freedom, not freedom from life, but freedom within life. This is the great paradox and power of the Buddha's teaching. We do not need to escape anything to be free. We only need to see things clearly. And it all begins with this, the first noble truth, the willingness to meet life exactly as it is, without denial, without resistance, without disguise. When we speak of suffering dukkha, we are not only speaking of pain, sorrow, or tragedy. We are speaking of the way we grasp, the way we cling, the way we try to freeze a world that is in constant motion. We are speaking of the subtle refusal to let things be, the deep habit of control that permeates our every interaction, thought, and plan. And the Buddha, with immeasurable compassion, invites us to see this, not to feel shame about it, not to run from it, but to open to it, gently, courageously. Because only through such opening can healing begin. And what is the fruit of this opening? It is wisdom, a wisdom that is not cold or distant, but warm and alive. A wisdom that no longer fights impermanence, but dances with it. A wisdom that knows, yes, all things pass, and that's why love matters now. That's why awareness matters now. That's why compassion cannot wait. The more we embrace the reality of change and loss, the more we cherish the fleeting beauty of every moment. This is not bleak, it is liberating. It allows us to step out of the fog of delusion and live with clarity and grace. When we truly understand dukkha, we begin to understand ourselves, not as isolated egos trying to win or survive, but as ever-changing processes, part of a vast unfolding. We see that our pain is not a personal failure, but a universal experience. We begin to hold ourselves and others with more tenderness. We forgive more easily. We listen more deeply. We become less obsessed with having things our way and more interested in being awake in the way things are. This is how the first noble truth transforms us. It breaks us open, not to make us helpless, but to make us honest. And in that honesty, we find our real strength. Not the strength of willpower or force, but the strength of inner stillness. The strength of not needing to grasp, not needing to run, not needing to be anyone or anything other than present. The more deeply we integrate this truth, the more our actions change. We become less reactive, more responsive, less caught up in craving, more anchored in contentment. We begin to make choices not from fear or habit, but from insight. Our speech becomes gentler, our minds quieter, our presence more nourishing to others. We no longer need to prove or defend ourselves constantly because we have begun to trust the peace that comes from letting go. And this peace is not theoretical. It is not hidden in the future. It begins here, in this very breath. This moment, right now, contains everything. In this moment, suffering may arise. In this moment, awakening may begin. The path is not elsewhere. It is this very body, this mind, this life, lived with mindfulness, seen with wisdom, embraced with compassion. The Buddha never promised a life without pain. What he offered was far more precious. The possibility of a life without unnecessary suffering. A life not governed by craving and fear, but guided by clarity. A life not built on illusions of permanence or control, but grounded in truth. That possibility still exists, as fresh today as it was 2,500 years ago. It exists in you. It exists in every person who dares to stop, to look, to feel, to wake up. And so, we end as we began, with the truth of dukkha. But now we understand it not as a burden, but as a teacher. Not as a curse, but as a key. A key that opens the door to the rest of the path. To the cessation of suffering, to the ending of clinging, to the realization of a freedom that no one can give or take away. This truth is not just to be learned, it is to be lived. Let it live in your breath. Let it live in your stillness. Let it live in your relationships, your choices, your gaze. Let it guide your steps, even when the path is unclear. Let it remind you, again and again, that the path of awakening does not begin with escape, but with a single, honest moment of seeing. This is the first noble truth. And this gentle, fearless seeing, is the beginning of peace.